Bruges' success was not an accident of geography or a mere result of commerce. It was the product of a city that understood what money truly needs to move: trust, speed, safety, and communication. Bruges offered all four. Its canals delivered goods, its merchants delivered credit, and its institutions delivered fairness. The world came to Bruges not only for profits, but for reliability. In Bruges, merchants found networks that spanned from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Scholars discovered new financial techniques, from double-entry accounting to risk sharing. Kings found lenders willing to support their ambitions. Every group sought something different, yet all found a system that worked. The city revealed a profound truth. Financial power does not require an empire, an army, or vast territory. It requires people who believe in the system and are willing to participate in it. Bruges was that place, a quiet city that became Europe's beating financial heart. Long after its ports silted and trade moved elsewhere, the ideas born in Bruges continued shaping global finance, proving that some legacies outlast even the greatest empires. Maria Maddalena of Austria entered the world in 1589 as a child already marked by the weight of her ancestry. She was the daughter of Charles II of Inner Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. And from the moment she was placed in her nurse's arms, everyone could see she carried the unmistakable signatures of the Habsburg bloodline. The long, narrow face, the sharp, angular features, and above all, the protruding jaw that generations would come to call the Habsburg jaw, a hereditary reminder of dynastic marriages meant to secure empires rather than health. These traits shaped her appearance long before they shaped her fate. Yet inside this fragile body lived a gentle, contemplative spirit. Maria Maddalena was known to smile shyly when spoken to, her eyes soft rather than commanding. In a family renowned for its political ruthlessness, she felt more like a quiet echo than a thunderclap. Those who knew her in childhood described her as tender-hearted, drawn to music and prayer more than to ambition or spectacle. She preferred the steady rhythm of liturgical chants to court gossip, and she often lingered near frescoes or illuminated manuscripts as if searching for a world more harmonious than her own. She grew up in Graz, a city shaped by the austere force of Counter-Reformation Catholicism. Her parents, devout and disciplined, surrounded their children with an atmosphere of piety that bordered on severity. Daily life in the Austrian court was structured, silent, and choreographed. The Habsburg daughters rose early for prayer, studied under strict tutors, and learned the skills expected of future consorts: modesty, obedience, and the art of concealing personal desires beneath layers of etiquette. Everything, how they walked, how they sat, how they breathed in the presence of elders, was training for a diplomatic marriage, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Even as a young girl, Maria Maddalena understood that her destiny would not be shaped by her own wishes. She watched her older sisters leave the palace one by one, sent to foreign courts where their names would be rewritten by marriage contracts. She heard the whispers of ambassadors evaluating her worth not as a person, but as a political vessel. She learned early that her body, her silence, and even her gentleness were assets to be traded, not traits to be nurtured. Still, she tried to build a small interior world of her own. Music became her refuge. She played the lute with a softness that made even stern courtiers pause at her door. Her confessor wrote that she had a soul easily moved by beauty, an unusual description in a family where piety was often prioritized over emotion. She was deeply attached to her siblings, particularly her sister Margaret, who later became Queen of Spain. When Margaret left for Madrid, Maria Maddalena watched the procession from a balcony, her hands clasped tightly, knowing that one day she would make a similar departure. At court, her appearance often drew subtle stares, though never openly criticized. The Habsburgs' distinct facial structure was considered a mark of noble blood, but it also set her apart in ways that made her painfully aware of her difference. She compensated by cultivating a demeanor of calm sweetness, hoping that grace could soften impressions that her face could not. Her mother encouraged her devotion, believing that spirituality would prepare her for the inevitable sacrifices of royal marriage. Maria Maddalena attended Mass with almost monastic regularity. She embroidered altar cloths, memorized long passages of Scripture, and developed a personal reverence for the Virgin Mary, perhaps seeing in her an image of feminine suffering sanctified into purpose. The palace around her was grand, but heavy, built of thick stone that trapped winter cold in its corridors. In the evenings, while torchlight flickered against the walls, Maria Maddalena often walked slowly through the galleries, stopping to gaze at portraits of ancestors whose lives had been spent serving dynastic ambitions. She saw in their eyes the same mixture of duty and resignation that was slowly forming in her own heart. When she turned 18, discussions about her marriage intensified. Letters traveled back and forth between Vienna, Madrid, Tuscany, and Bavaria. Her tutors noticed a subtle change in her behavior. She became quieter, her expressions more guarded, as if bracing herself for a destiny she could feel approaching. She understood the nature of royal unions well enough. They were treaties disguised as weddings, alliances written across young women's bodies. And then, the decision was made. She would marry Cosimo II de' Medici, heir to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. The Medici needed a Habsburg bride to reinforce their legitimacy among European powers, and Maria Maddalena, mild, devout, and dutiful, was deemed the perfect candidate. She received the news with a bowed head and clasped hands, offering no resistance. She was trained not to resist. As preparations began for her departure, she packed small pieces of her childhood, music sheets, devotional medals, letters from her sisters. She touched the snow outside her window one last time, letting the cold sink into her skin. The mountains of Austria, the hymns of Graz, the familiar cadence of her native German, all of it would soon be behind her. Maria Maddalena stepped into adulthood the way she had lived her childhood, quietly, obediently, and with a heart already beginning to fracture under expectations far older than she was. And though she could not yet know it, every mile that carried her toward Florence would also carry her further away from the sense of belonging she would spend the rest of her life searching for. Maria Maddalena's journey from Graz to Florence in 1608 was not the triumphant procession of a radiant bride, but a diplomatic transaction wrapped in ceremonial silk. She left Austria with the calm resignation of someone who had always known her path would not be her own. At 18, she was a Habsburg princess on parchment before she was a woman in the world. The Medici court had requested a bride of impeccable lineage, one whose bloodline could reinforce their fading influence. Maria Maddalena fit the role perfectly. Pious, obedient, uncontroversial, a daughter molded for alliance rather than affection. Her arrival in Florence dazzled onlookers. The city unfurled its banners, musicians played triumphant fanfares, and nobles lined the streets to witness the union between Tuscany and Austria. Yet beneath the brilliant colors and fanfare, Maria Maddalena felt the invisible distance between herself and the world she had entered. The dialect was foreign, the gestures unfamiliar, the sun brighter and less forgiving than the gentle Austrian light she knew. When she stepped into the Palazzo Pitti for the first time, its sumptuous halls felt suffocating rather than grand. She came from a court of cold stone and spiritual austerity. Florence, with its golden facades and indulgent warmth, seemed almost unreal. Cosimo II de' Medici, the man she now called husband, was intelligent, courteous, and deeply cultured. But he was also frail, his health undermined by chronic illnesses that shadowed every moment of his life. He suffered from debilitating bouts of tuberculosis, weakness, and pain that forced him into long periods of rest. Though he greeted Maria Maddalena with kindness and tried to ease her transition into Florentine life, their relationship was defined more by duty than by passion. He lacked the vigor to pursue love, and she lacked the confidence to seek it. Their marriage settled into a gentle, distant coexistence, cordial, polite, but never intimate. Cosimo's illnesses shaped the rhythm of their household. Many nights, he lay awake coughing behind closed doors while Maria Maddalena sat alone in her private chamber, reading devotional texts or whispering prayers for his recovery. The court physicians administered broths, herbs, and bloodletting rituals, but nothing restored him. She watched him age before her eyes, his vitality eroding long before his youth should have left him. Their union, though peaceful, remained overshadowed by the looming specter of mortality. Despite this distance, Maria Maddalena fulfilled her expected role with unwavering diligence. Between 1609 and 1620, she bore 8 children, a heavy burden for a woman of frail health. Each pregnancy weighed upon her like another stone placed on an already fragile bridge. Yet she endured silently, as she had been trained to do. Her children, however, arrived in the world carrying a tragic inheritance: the combined frailties of the Medici and Habsburg bloodlines. Several suffered from chronic illnesses, delicate constitutions, or developmental challenges that court physicians could neither explain nor cure. The sound of small coffins being carried through the halls of the Palazzo Pitti etched themselves into her soul. 2 of her children died in infancy. Another struggled with physical deformities. Each loss carved new lines across her face, deepening the sadness that had always lingered behind her gentle eyes. She mourned quietly, often retreating into prayer rather than into the arms of her husband, who was himself too ill and exhausted to offer comfort. Florence, for all its beauty, was not kind to her. The Medici court was a place of competition and subtle hostilities, filled with factions that revolved around Christine of Lorraine, Cosimo's powerful mother. Christine, experienced in political maneuvering, dominated court decisions and overshadowed Maria Maddalena at every turn. She viewed the young Habsburg duchess as timid and malleable, a woman easy to manipulate or dismiss. Even the courtiers, accustomed to the flamboyant charm of earlier Medici brides, found Maria Maddalena too reserved, too austere, too foreign. She attempted to adapt, attending court festivities and learning Italian, but she remained an outsider. Her Austrian accent marked her as different. Her piety seemed excessive in a city known for its Renaissance splendor. Even her face, unmistakably Habsburg, set her apart, evoking both curiosity and faint derision. She felt like a figure misplaced in a painting, drawn in another style, from another era, unable to blend into the warm Florentine palette. As Cosimo's health worsened, the pressures placed upon her increased. She became both caretaker and future regent, expected to preserve continuity for a duchy that had never fully accepted her. The court's expectations pressed upon her shoulders like a tightening vice. She felt the weight of Austria pulling her backward and the demands of Florence pushing her forward, trapping her in a life that felt increasingly claustrophobic. Yet, beneath the layers of duty, grief, and political tension, Maria Maddalena still nurtured a quiet longing for simplicity. She found moments of solace in the palace gardens, where the cypresses reminded her faintly of the forests she had known as a child. She clung to small rituals from her homeland, humming German hymns under her breath, writing devotional letters to her sisters, preparing small altars in her chambers. These fragments of Austria were all she had left to anchor her spirit. By 1620, Cosimo's health had deteriorated so severely that the court could no longer pretend stability. He moved slowly, coughed relentlessly, and spent more time bedridden than ruling. Maria Maddalena watched his decline with a mixture of fear and resignation, aware that his death would thrust her into a role she neither desired nor felt prepared for. She had entered Florence as a bride and became a mother, but she would soon be something far more daunting. A widow in a hostile court, responsible for a child king and a duchy spiraling into uncertainty. Her marriage had begun as a political alliance, not a love story. But as it neared its end, Maria Maddalena realized that it had also been the only source of fragile stability she possessed in Florence. When Cosimo's life dimmed, so too did the last faint light that had sheltered her from the storm waiting just beyond the palace walls. Cosimo Sveggen's final years unfolded like a slow, inevitable eclipse. By 1620, the young Grand Duke, once celebrated for his intelligence and refined taste, had become a pale figure confined to his chambers. His cough echoed through the corridors of Palazzo Pitti like the tolling of a distant bell, each fit sending tremors of fear through a court already bracing for change. Physicians surrounded him with the desperate rituals of early modern medicine: bloodletting, poultices, broths infused with rare herbs. Yet nothing revived the man who had never truly possessed robust health. His decline felt less like an illness and more like a candle drowning in its own wax. Maria Maddalena moved quietly through these final days, her steps soft against the cold marble floors. She kept vigil at his bedside, folding his blankets, speaking to him in low, steady tones, offering the gentleness she had cultivated all her life. There were no passionate declarations, no dramatic embraces. Only two people bound by duty, sorrow, and a thin thread of companionship that had been woven through years of shared burdens. She had long understood that love, as Florence celebrated it in poetry and art, was not her portion. What she and Cosimo shared was something quieter: endurance, mutual respect, and a fragile sense of trust born from suffering. When Cosimo died in February 1621 at the age of 30, the palace fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The bells of Florence tolled mournfully across the Arno, announcing the end of a reign that had lasted barely a decade. Maria Maddalena, widowed at 32, felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Cosimo's death was not only a personal loss, but a political earthquake. Their eldest son, Ferdinand II, was only 10 years old, small for his age, delicate, shy, and utterly unprepared to rule. His youth triggered the mechanism the Medici feared most: a regency led by women. Florentine law appointed two figures to guide the duchy until Ferdinand reached maturity: Maria Maddalena, the Habsburg widow, and Christine of Lorraine, Cosimo's formidable mother. Thus began what the city would later call the Regenza delle Due Donne, the reign of the two widows. But the title, though poetic, concealed a darker truth. This was not a partnership of equals. Christine of Lorraine, granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici and raised in the cunning world of French courts, was a political strategist of rare intensity. She understood alliances, manipulated factions, and viewed governance as a continuous game of tension and reward. She was everything Maria Maddalena was not: assertive, sharp-tongued, relentlessly pragmatic. Where Maria Maddalena hesitated, Christine pressed forward. Where Maria Maddalena sought harmony, Christine wielded conflict as a tool. Their regency began under the shadow of Florence's growing instability. Costs from decades of Medici extravagance had drained the treasury. Trade routes were shifting. The Tuscan economy strained under both internal mismanagement and European turbulence. Yet because the regency bore the name of two women, public criticism immediately settled upon their shoulders. Even within the palace, factions formed like cracks in stone. Christine gathered advisors loyal to her French lineage and long-standing influence. Maria Maddalena, uncertain and increasingly isolated, leaned toward clerical counselors and envoys connected to the Habsburg family. The court interpreted this as foreign interference, a princess still tethered to Vienna rather than committed to Florence. Her devoutness, once considered a virtue, became an accusation. Her fragile demeanor was read as weakness. Her silence fueled rumors rather than diffused them. Decisions made during the regency were rarely hers alone. Christine orchestrated most policies, often presenting them as joint decrees. But the Florentine public, predisposed to distrust foreign influence, blamed Maria Maddalena for everything that went wrong. When taxes rose, she was blamed. When expenditures ballooned, she was blamed. When famine threatened the countryside, she was blamed. Even the growing debts of the Medici banking system were attributed to her Austrian extravagance, an accusation far removed from reality. In truth, Maria Maddalena lived modestly compared to other Medici women. She spent more time in chapels than in salons, and her personal tastes leaned toward devotional art rather than ostentatious splendor. But perception mattered more than fact. And in the politically charged environment of 1620s Florence, she was an easy target. A foreign widow, gentle to a fault, overshadowed by a powerful mother-in-law who knew how to deflect criticism with surgical precision. Her son, Ferdinand II, clung to her with a mixture of fear and dependence. Sensitive and sickly, he often retreated into her chambers, seeking comfort. Maria Maddalena tried to shield him from the pressures of court life. But she could not shield him from the legacy he had inherited. He was a Medici prince with a Habsburg face, carrying the vulnerabilities of both dynasties. She watched him grow thinner each year, and in his trembling hands and uneven breath she saw echoes of Cosimo's fragility. The regency, lasting 6 difficult years, became a crucible that tested her already fragile spirit. Every day demanded decisions she did not feel equipped to make. Every evening brought whispers of criticism drifting through the palace like unwelcome ghosts. The weight of Florence, a city that had never embraced her, pressed down harder than ever. And as she moved through the ornate halls of Palazzo Pitti, she often felt like an intruder wandering a labyrinth. Not a ruler, but a woman lost in a maze of responsibilities she had never desired. By 1627, when Ferdinand II was finally declared of age, the regency ended not with gratitude, but with relief. The city exhaled as though a burden had been lifted, though nothing substantial had changed. Christine retreated into the background with her power intact. Maria Maddalena was quietly pushed aside, her role reduced to ceremonial appearances and maternal duties. The crown remained in the family, but her influence dissolved like mist in the morning sun. Cosimo's death had placed a duchy in her hands, but instead of elevating her, the regency had consumed her, piece by piece, year by year, until all that remained was a gentle woman carrying the blame of an entire city. When the regency ended in 1627, Maria Maddalena might have hoped for a quieter life, freed from political turmoil. But Florence, a city with a sharp memory and sharper tongue, refused to forget the years of uncertainty that had unfolded under her name. The criticisms that had begun as whispers during the regency hardened into public sentiment. To many Florentines, she was not Maria Maddalena the woman, nor Maria Maddalena the widow. She was Maria Maddalena the foreigner, the Habsburg interloper whose presence symbolized everything the city resented. The accusations took on a life of their own. Pamphlets circulated through the markets, each more biting than the last. Some portrayed her as a shadowy figure cloaked in religious fanaticism, others as a spendthrift duchess draining the treasury to satisfy Austrian tastes. The truth was far less dramatic. Her personal spending was modest, restrained even, but nuance rarely survives in the theater of public opinion. And Florence, deeply proud, famously suspicious of outsiders, preferred stories that pointed blame in simple, vivid strokes. The Palazzo Pitti, which had once seemed merely foreign to her, became a gilded cage. Its walls, covered in frescoes and tapestries, echoed with the murmurs of servants and courtiers who carried news of the city's discontent like bees carrying pollen. Even the palace gardens, lush and meticulously kept, felt heavy beneath the weight of unseen judgment. When she walked along the cypress-lined paths, she often sensed eyes on her, watching, assessing, condemning. Christine of Lorraine's legacy lingered heavily in these years. The older dowager had orchestrated much of the court's extravagance, yet managed to redirect the public's anger toward Maria Maddalena. Christine's shrewd political instincts had protected her reputation, while Maria Maddalena, softer and more unguarded, absorbed the blows. Historians later noted that Florence viewed her through two opposing lenses: as an austere Habsburg who brought religious rigidity, and simultaneously as a spendthrift who indulged in clerical excess. The contradictions did not matter. Perception had already hardened into myth. The purchases that drew the most ire were not jewels or silks or feasts. They were religious relics, devotional paintings, and items tied to her homeland. She ordered chalices forged in Austrian styles, collected small statues of saints, and commissioned a handful of sacred artworks that reminded her of Graz. These objects were not meant to display power or opulence. They were fragile bridges back to a world she missed. But to Florentines, struggling with rising taxes, famine, and economic decline, they symbolized waste. Why, some asked, does the foreign duchess fill her chambers with trinkets while the people tighten their belts? Even the sound of German prayers drifting from her private chapel became fodder for criticism. Whispers circulated that she surrounded herself with Austrian confessors, that she allowed foreign advisors to influence her son, that she secretly favored Habsburg interests over Tuscany's well-being. None of these claims held weight, yet they persisted, repeated often enough to gain the force of truth. Her isolation grew thicker with each passing year. Invitations to court festivities dwindled. Artists who once sought her patronage now aligned themselves with more influential figures. And within the palace, the staff began favoring Christine's old networks over hers, leaving Maria Maddalena increasingly alone among people who were technically her subjects, but emotionally her strangers. The Florentine streets, vibrant with merchants and artisans, seemed colder when she was mentioned. Some called her the ghost duchess, always present yet never belonging. Others blamed her for the deteriorating condition of the Medici state. The debts, the fading military power, the diplomatic missteps. She became a convenient repository for anxieties the city was unwilling to direct toward the real culprits: structural economic decline, years of mismanagement, and the fading brilliance of a dynasty that had once lit the Italian peninsula. In private, Maria Maddalena retreated deeper into devotion. She spent long hours in the palace chapel, lighting candles for the children she had lost and for the son she feared she might lose as well. Her health, which had always been delicate, worsened under the pressure of grief and public disdain. Headaches became more frequent, fatigue more persistent. Some days she struggled to rise from her bed, her limbs heavy, her breath shallow. Court physicians attributed it to melancholy humors, the era's attempt to describe the crushing weight of depression. Letters she wrote during these years reveal the quiet erosion of her spirit. In one, she confessed to feeling like a tree uprooted, trying to bloom in foreign soil. In another, she admitted that she no longer recognized the woman she had become, so diminished, so voiceless, so tired. She longed not for power, nor for public favor, but for a sense of belonging she had never been granted. Her son Ferdinand II, though fond of her, occupied a world increasingly dominated by advisors and favorites who viewed his mother as a relic of the regency, useful in ceremonial matters, but irrelevant to real governance. When he did visit her chambers, he came as a distracted young ruler rather than a son seeking comfort. The distance between them widened, not out of malice, but out of the natural drift created by politics, expectations, and the ever-present machinery of the Medici court. By the late 1620s, Maria Maddalena's name had become synonymous with Florence's frustrations. Everything she did, every prayer whispered, every relic purchased, every quiet attempt at comfort, was interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Her solitude deepened until the grand palace felt like a vast echo chamber, amplifying her isolation rather than sheltering her from it. And yet, despite the hostility, she continued to move with the same gentle demeanor she had carried since childhood. She bore the resentment of a city with the patience of someone who had spent her entire life learning to endure. But even endurance has limits, and the more Florence rejected her, the more her heart began to drift back toward Austria, the one place where she had once felt, however briefly, at home. When Ferdinand II officially assumed power in 1627, Maria Maddalena did not so much step down from authority as fade quietly out of sight. Her retreat from public life was not marked by ceremony or gratitude, but by a gentle, almost imperceptible erasure. One day, she was the co-regent of Tuscany, her name appearing beside decrees and decisions. The next, she was a silent presence wandering through the vast chambers of Palazzo Pitti, her footsteps swallowed by the marble floors. What remained to her were titles with no influence, rooms without visitors, and a life that unfolded in slow, echoing intervals. The palace, magnificent in design, felt increasingly cavernous, as if its grand corridors had grown aware of her insignificance and stretched themselves further just to remind her of it. She became a figure of soft routines, morning prayers in the private chapel, brief walks through inner courtyards, afternoons spent in muted contemplation. The bustle of court life continued around her, but she moved through it like a wraith, seldom addressed, rarely acknowledged. Her health began to deteriorate in ways that alarmed even the inattentive court physicians. What they labeled as dropsy or nervous weakness was in truth the slow collapse of a woman who had spent years carrying burdens beyond her capacity. She developed recurring headaches, sharp, throbbing pains that made her temples ache as though a tightening band circled her skull. Some days, her joints stiffened so severely that she struggled to lift herself from bed. She often complained of sudden waves of exhaustion, as if her body simply stopped cooperating without warning. Servants reported finding her seated by windows overlooking the distant hills, murmuring prayers in German. The sound of the language, soft and unfamiliar to the Florentine ear, seemed to transport her back to the mountains of her childhood. She clung to these fragments of Austria with the desperation of someone drowning, grasping at memories for air. The hymns of her youth, the ones she had once sung with her sisters in Graz, became her companions in a palace that no longer held anyone who truly knew her. She wrote letters more frequently now. Though fewer of them ever received answers, many were addressed to her siblings, scattered across the Habsburg courts of Vienna, Innsbruck, and Madrid. In these letters, she rarely spoke of politics or daily life. Instead, she described her loneliness with an honesty she had never allowed herself before. "I feel unrooted," she wrote once, "as though I have been transplanted into a soil that does not nourish me." In another letter, she lamented that her days passed like shadows stretching across a silent room. Ferdinand II, though affectionate toward his mother in his youth, grew distant as he assumed the full responsibilities of rule. Court favorites, advisors, and political pressures surrounded him, leaving little space for maternal closeness. When he visited her chambers, it was usually out of duty, offering brief conversations that ended almost as soon as they began. He would kiss her hand, speak of matters she barely understood or wished to revisit, and depart with the distracted briskness of a young ruler caught in a web of expectations. She remained proud of him, yet each visit left her with a quiet ache, a reminder that even her role as a mother was slipping from her grasp. Outside her rooms, Florence continued to change in ways that deepened her sense of displacement. The Medici court embraced a new generation of musicians, scientists, and artists whose styles felt foreign to her religiously anchored tastes. Banquets grew louder, fashion grew more flamboyant, and political alliances shifted with dizzying speed. The world seemed to move forward while she remained frozen in the stillness of her private grief. Her retreat into religious devotion intensified. The chapel within Palazzo Pitti became her sanctuary, a dim space lit by flickering candles and the faint scent of incense. She spent hours kneeling before the altar, her hands clasped tightly, her lips forming silent prayers. Faith had always been her anchor, but now it became a refuge from everything she could not control: her failing health, her dwindling influence, her estranged role within the Medici family. Some courtiers mocked her piety, calling it excessive or archaic. Others whispered that she hid behind devotion to avoid confronting the realities of the world. But they mistook her faith for escape when, in truth, it was the last part of herself that she still recognized. Family portraits lining the walls seemed to haunt her. Images of Cosimo, thin and pale in the final years of his life. Of her children, several of whom had died young. Of herself, painted in her youth with a restrained elegance untouched by sorrow. She would stop before these portraits, sometimes for long minutes, tracing the outlines of faces with her eyes. It was as though she hoped the paintings might speak to her, offering comfort or explanation for the choices that had shaped her life. But they remained silent, their colors vibrant even as her world dimmed. There were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when she considered leaving Florence altogether. But she lacked the authority to make such a request, and the Medici court saw no pressing reason to grant her freedom. Besides, her health rarely allowed long journeys. She remained in the palace, the walls tightening around her like slow-moving vines. By her early 40s, Maria Maddalena had become a figure defined not by power or influence, but by absence. Absence from politics, absence from affection, absence from the city that continued to blame her for sins she had not committed. She moved through life like a candle burning at low flame, flickering, steady, but slowly shortening with each passing day. And yet, despite all this, she never stopped longing. For Austria, for the familiar cadence of German hymns, for the clear winter air that cut sharply against the skin, for a sense of home she had not felt since the day she crossed the Alps as a young bride. That longing, quiet but relentless, would shape the final chapter of her life. As the years drifted past her like autumn leaves falling one by one, Maria Maddalena found her world narrowing to a single, persistent longing. She wanted to go home. Not to a palace, not to power, not even to family prestige, but home in the purest sense of the word. Back to the mountains where she had learned to pray. Back to the winter air so sharp it stung the lungs. Back to the hymns sung in German, a language she still whispered in the quiet corners of the Palazzo Pitti, even as the sound grew foreign to Florentine ears. Florence had never embraced her, and it no longer tried. With her influence gone, she had become a fixture of the palace like an aging tapestry, still present but easy to overlook. Her walks through the corridors grew slower, her visits to the gardens shorter. Even her devotional routines, once done with discipline, were now performed with the frailty of a woman whose hands trembled when holding a rosary. Her spirit was thinning, stretched between a past she could no longer touch and a present that offered no comfort. It was during these years of quiet suffering that the idea of returning to Austria began to take root in her heart. At first, it was only a soft wish, an unspoken yearning that surfaced in her letters as veiled comments about the cold air of Graz or the peaceful solemnity of the Habsburg chapels. But as her health worsened, the longing sharpened into something more urgent, almost physical. She began to dream of her childhood, the narrow stone halls of her parents' palace, the mist rising over the Styrian hills, the sound of her sister Margaret's laughter before marriage carried her away to Spain. When she awoke from these memories, the gilded ceilings of Florence felt unbearably distant from the life she truly wanted to return to. The desire soon grew strong enough that she could no longer hide it behind polite metaphors. She began making formal requests, carefully worded petitions to the Medici court, framed not as longing, but as necessity. She asked for permission to travel for reasons of health, or to visit her sister, or to undertake a religious pilgrimage. Each request was more transparent than the last. Everyone understood what she was really asking. Freedom from the city that had swallowed 23 years of her life. The court hesitated. Florence had always feared losing control of its political connections. Allowing the widowed duchess, still a Habsburg princess, to leave raised concerns about diplomacy and public image. Moreover, there were practical worries. Her health was fragile, the journey long, the roads unpredictable. But these considerations mattered little to Maria Maddalena. For the first time in decades, she wanted something not out of duty, but out of the deepest chambers of her exhausted heart. In the months that followed, she withdrew even further into herself. Servants noticed that she spent long hours packing and repacking small boxes of personal belongings, items far too modest to belong to a former Grand Duchess. A rosary carved from alpine wood, a miniature portrait of her mother, folded letters from her siblings, their ink fading at the edges, sheets of sacred music that she had once played as a girl. These objects, fragile and unremarkable to others, were pieces of the life she had left behind. Holding them gave her the illusion that Austria was somehow closer. Her rooms, usually dimly lit, became a sanctuary filled with echoes of her past. She would sit by the window as evening fell, watching the distant hills darken and imagining them as the slopes of Styria. She murmured German hymns under her breath, her voice carrying the softness of someone speaking to ghosts. The palace around her bustled with political chatter, feasts, disputes, shifting alliances. But she no longer cared. The city could rise or fall. Her son could negotiate treaties or lose them. Florentine nobles could whisper whatever they wished. None of it mattered anymore. Her soul was already walking the long road home. At last, in early 1631, permission was granted. The decision came quietly, shaped more by political convenience than compassion. But Maria Maddalena did not care about motives. For her, it was liberation. A door opening after decades of silence. She prepared not as a duchess, but as a pilgrim. No grand procession, no retinue of nobles, only a small escort, a carriage, and the personal belongings she had guarded for years. She began writing farewell letters, though few were sent. The court had so thoroughly forgotten her that there were few people left to bid farewell to. Despite her failing health, she moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Even the servants noticed the soft glow in her eyes, as if she were warming herself at a fire she had thought long extinguished. She prayed with gratitude, her hands steadier than they had been in months. She touched the marble walls of the palace one last time, acknowledging the place that had held her, hurt her, and ultimately erased her. She did not know, could not know, that her journey home would be her final chapter. She only knew that her life in Florence had become a long exile, and that somewhere beyond the Alps, the memory of who she had once been was waiting for her. The carriage rolled out of the Palazzo Pitti with little fanfare. Florence barely noticed her departure. But for Maria Maddalena, it was the beginning of the return she had dreamed of for half her life. A fragile hope that, at last, she might find peace among the mountains where her story had begun. The journey north began quietly, without the ceremonial fanfare that usually accompanied a Medici departure. Maria Maddalena sat in her modest carriage, wrapped in a thick cloak despite the lingering warmth of early spring. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. Each mile placed more distance between her and Florence, the city that had drained her spirit and brought her closer to the mountains of her childhood. The sky above Tuscany was a soft blue, but she looked toward the horizon with the eyes of someone searching for colder skies. At first, the travel soothed her. The countryside unfolded like a forgotten lullaby. Rolling hills, vineyards shimmering in the sun, quiet monasteries perched on cliffs. She breathed more deeply than she had in years, as though each inhalation contained fragments of the freedom she had long been denied. Even her attendants noticed the shift in her demeanor. She spoke more, smiled faintly, asked about distances, about weather, about the towns they would pass. For the first time since her youth, she seemed animated by hope. But her body, worn thin by years of illness and sorrow, could not match her spirit's determination. By the time the entourage reached the plains of northern Italy, subtle signs of decline began to appear. She complained of chills despite layers of blankets. She felt waves of nausea after the simplest meals. Her headaches, once dull and intermittent, sharpened into piercing blows that made her close her eyes against the sunlight. Still, she insisted on continuing. She believed the discomfort was nothing more than fatigue from travel. "I will be well when we reach cooler air," she whispered, as if promising herself a future she could almost touch. Her attendants exchanged uncertain glances, but obeyed her wishes. She had waited 23 years for this journey. Denying her now felt cruel. Padua lay ahead like a crossroads between worlds, one pointing back toward Tuscany, the other toward the Alps. When the carriage wheels touched the city's stone streets, Maria Maddalena was already weakened. She moved slowly when helping hands lifted her down, her steps fragile, her skin pale beneath her veil. That evening, she asked for a small fire to be lit, even though the air was mild. She sat close to the flames, shivering slightly, as though Florence's chill had somehow followed her north. By dawn, her condition had worsened. She awoke with violent abdominal pain, doubled over as waves of nausea and fever tore through her. Her attendants panicked, summoning local physicians. They arrived with their leather bags and practiced solemnity. But their remedies, bitter brews, heated compresses, whispered diagnoses, could not anchor her failing body. Her fever climbed so high that her vision blurred. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words in German that none of the Italians around her could understand. Sometimes she whispered the names of her siblings, long absent from her life. Other times she spoke prayers learned in the halls of Graz. The language of her childhood returned in her delirium, as if the mind, confronted by death, instinctively reached for its earliest comfort. Modern historians suspect she suffered from acute gastroenteritis, or perhaps sepsis triggered by infection. In the 17th century, either condition was a death sentence, especially for someone already frail. But her attendants, untrained and terrified, saw only that their lady, who had endured 23 years of quiet sorrow, was now fighting a losing battle in a foreign inn, miles from the home she yearned for, and the homeland she had never forgotten. The physicians recommended rest. They urged her to remain in Padua until she regained strength. But Maria Maddalena, even in agony, whispered through trembling lips, "I must go home." Not Florence. She meant Austria, the Alps, the place where she had been Maria Maddalena the girl, not Maria Maddalena the duchess. But her body no longer obeyed her will. By the second night, the fever had consumed her. She lay in a dimly lit room, the shutters closed to hush the noise of the street outside. Candlelight flickered across her face, revealing the angular shadow of her Habsburg features. Features that had followed her across borders and through a lifetime of expectation. The attendants took turns cooling her forehead with damp cloths, whispering reassurances they did not believe. Her breathing grew shallow, irregular. Her hands twitched softly at her sides, as if reaching towards something she alone could see. Sometimes she winced, as though her memories themselves hurt. Other times she seemed peaceful, her lips moving in silent prayer. The scent of burning wax mingled with the faint smell of sickness, creating an atmosphere both sacred and unbearable. Padua, indifferent to her suffering, continued its nightly rhythms. Merchants shuttered their stalls. Bells tolled in distant churches. Horses clattered over cobblestones. Life went on, unaware that a woman who had once ruled Tuscany, however reluctantly, however briefly, was slowly slipping away in a modest rented room. Her attendants realized with dawning horror that they could not save her. They were too far from Florence to summon trusted physicians, too far from Austria to find comfort among familiar faces, too far from both worlds, caught, like she was, between two dynasties and none. As dawn approached on the third day, Maria Maddalena's strength faltered completely. Her fevered murmurs softened into faint breaths. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, as if searching for the mountains she would never reach. Then her chest rose once more and stilled. The room was silent. A foreign city held her final breath, and the road home, the one she had prayed for, waited for her in a way she did not expect. Maria Maddalena of Austria died in Padua, not as a grand duchess surrounded by courtiers, but as a weary traveler lying in a rented room above unfamiliar streets. Her passing was quiet, so quiet, in fact, that for a moment no one noticed. A single candle flickered by her bedside, its flame bending in the draught from a cracked window. Outside, the early morning bells began to toll, marking the beginning of another ordinary day in a city that had no idea a Habsburg princess had just breathed her last. For a woman born into dynasties that had shaped Europe, her end felt painfully small. No royal physicians, no family members, no children, no husband's hand to hold. Only attendants, faithful but frightened, stood at her bedside, their faces etched with helplessness. They whispered her name as though speaking might tether her spirit to the world a little longer. But the fragile body that had endured decades of sorrow lay still, its burdens finally released. Her final moments were marked not by ceremony, but by silence. The attendants tried to comfort themselves by believing she had not suffered, that her last breath had been soft, that her spirit had slipped gently into a peace denied to her in life. Yet the truth remained that Maria Maddalena had died in a city where the language spoken around her was not the one she prayed in, where the walls were not the ones she had known as a child, where the scent of the air carried no hint of her homeland. She had lived between two worlds, Habsburg and Medici, and in death she belonged to neither. News of her passing spread slowly. Padua's local officials arrived to document the death of a foreign noblewoman, speaking in formal tones that felt cold against the tender grief of those who had traveled with her. They asked practical questions: dates, titles, cause of death. No one asked who she had been. No one wanted to know the sorrows she had carried since she first left Graz at 18. Her attendants answered politely, though some fought tears when they were forced to recount the events of the past 3 days. Arrangements had to be made. Her body, they were told, could not remain in Padua. She must be returned to Florence, to the Medici vault where generations of rulers lay in stone silence. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Maria Maddalena had spent 23 years longing to escape Florence, and now she would return there in death, carried not by will, but by obligation. Preparations began with the muted haste that surrounds the death of royalty. Her attendants washed her body gently, smoothing the creases from her brow as though trying to erase the hardships she had endured. They dressed her in a simple gown, far less elaborate than the garments she had once worn as duchess. A rosary, one she had brought from Austria and kept beside her bed for decades, was placed in her hands. Its wooden beads, polished by years of prayer, now rested silently against her cold fingers. Outside the window, the city moved on. Merchants opened their stalls, monks crossed the squares in their morning routines. Wagons rattled over the cobblestones. Padua had not paused for her life, and it did not pause for her death. Yet within that small rented room, time seemed suspended. The attendants stood motionless, unwilling to leave her side. They did not speak. They did not cry. They simply remained, as if their presence might atone for the loneliness of her final hours. When her carriage was prepared, her body was placed inside with care, wrapped in linens that once belonged to the Medici household. The sun had risen by then, casting a soft, pale light across the streets. Her attendants followed behind, heads lowered, moving through the city like mourners in a procession no one else recognized. To the citizens of Padua, she was merely a noblewoman whose journey had ended abruptly. Only those who walked with her understood the weight of her unfinished return. The road back to Florence was long. The wheels of the carriage creaked as it carried her southward, retracing the same path she had traveled with such fragile hope only days before. Now the landscapes that had once promised freedom rolled past her lifeless form. The vineyards, the plains, the distant peaks she had never reached, all passed in silence. When she arrived in Florence, the reception was formal but cool. The city did not grieve for her. Florence had never given her affection in life, and death changed nothing. Court officials followed protocol, performing the requisite ceremonies with precision but little warmth. Her son Ferdinand II, shocked by the suddenness of her death, ordered the traditional rites but did not collapse in sorrow. Their relationship, once tender, had long been thinned by the distance imposed by politics and illness. She was laid to rest among the Medici, not by choice, but by tradition. Her tomb was adorned with reverence, yet her story remained barely spoken. There were no grand eulogies, no public mourning, no chronicler eager to preserve her memory. Her name faded into the long lineage of Florence's rulers, noted but not cherished. In the end, her death reflected her life, quiet, misunderstood, overshadowed, and marked by a longing that had never been fulfilled. Maria Maddalena had lived as a foreigner in a magnificent palace, and she died a foreigner on the road between two worlds. Her final rest came not in Austria, where her heart remained, but in Florence, the city that had shaped her sorrow and claimed her only in death. Her story became a whispered footnote in the histories of two dynasties. But for a brief moment, as her attendants closed the carriage door in Padua, the world had felt the profound stillness of a woman whose life had been defined not by crowns or victories, but by the quiet endurance of exile. The legacy of Maria Maddalena of Austria is not one inscribed in marble triumphs or political victories. Instead, it is the quiet imprint left by a woman caught between two great houses, neither of which ever fully claimed her. To historians, she remains a footnote in the long, glittering ledger of the Medici and Habsburg dynasties. Yet within that footnote lies a story of profound displacement, of a life shaped not by choices, but by the decisions of others. Her existence was defined by duty from the very beginning. Born into the Habsburgs, she inherited not only their unmistakable features, but also a legacy of political expectation. Her marriage to Cosimo II tied her to the Medici, another powerful dynasty, one steeped in Renaissance grandeur, but already sliding into decline. She was asked to bridge these two worlds, to embody unity, to produce heirs, to soothe tensions. But in truth, she was never permitted to be more than a symbol. She arrived in Florence as an alliance made flesh, and she remained trapped within that role until the end. Her regency, often criticized by contemporaries, has been reassessed by modern scholars. Far from the incompetent ruler described in Florentine pamphlets, Maria Maddalena emerges as a woman placed in an impossible situation. She governed alongside Christine of Lorraine, a masterful political strategist whose influence overshadowed every decision. The reign of the two widows was marked by factionalism, economic strain, and mounting debts, problems rooted far deeper than anything Maria Maddalena could have controlled. And yet, public blame settled on her shoulders, because she was foreign, because she was gentle, because she lacked the ruthless sharpness expected of Medici rulers. In many ways, her story reflects the limitations imposed on aristocratic women of the 17th century. They were expected to secure alliances through marriage, to bear children regardless of health, to assume political roles without training, and to absorb public criticism without protest. Maria Maddalena fulfilled every expectation faithfully, but the world punished her nonetheless. She became a case study in how dynasties consumed the women they married, quietly, systematically, and without remorse. Her children, too, carried the weight of that legacy. Of the 8 she bore, several died young, and those who survived inherited the frailties of both bloodlines. Ferdinand II, her eldest, struggled with chronic illness throughout his life. Her daughters, raised in the shadow of palace politics, entered marriages that offered them little more emotional refuge than she herself had found. The fragility of the next Medici generation, physical, emotional, political, stands as a testament to the pressures placed upon their mother. She bore the burden of dynastic continuation, only to watch that continuation falter before her eyes. Yet despite her sorrow, Maria Maddalena left behind traces of quiet strength. She did not govern with brilliance, but she governed with sincerity. She tried to preserve stability in a city that mistrusted her. She raised her children with tenderness, even as illness ravaged their home. She endured loneliness with a grace that defied the harsh judgment cast upon her. And when life in Florence became too heavy to bear, she summoned the courage, fragile, desperate, but real, to attempt the journey back to the homeland she had never stopped loving. Her death in Padua cemented her as a tragic figure lost between two identities. To Austria, she was a daughter long absent. To Florence, she was a duchess never fully embraced. She belonged everywhere and nowhere, drifting through palaces like a visitor rather than a resident. Even in death, she returned to Florence not by choice, but by custom. Her body placed in the Medici vault among people who had never truly welcomed her in life. Her legacy today is being quietly rediscovered. Historians describe her life as an example of the invisible burdens carried by royal women. Burdens that rarely make it into chronicles dominated by wars, treaties, and the deeds of kings. Instead, her narrative reveals the emotional cost of dynastic politics. The displacement, the isolation, the yearning for a sense of belonging, denied by circumstances far beyond her control. In the story of Maria Maddalena, we see a woman who endured without applause, who suffered without rebellion, who loved without being loved in return by the city she served. We see a life marked not by grand failures, but by the slow erosion caused by exile and expectation. Her name may not shine brightly in the annals of history, but it flickers softly, like a candle burning in a quiet chapel, reminding us of all the women who lived and died in the shadows of power. Perhaps her true legacy lies not in the titles she held, nor in the roles she performed, but in the human story beneath them, a story of longing, endurance, and the fragile hope for a home. Through her, we understand that even in the grandest palaces, loneliness can echo louder than grandeur, and silence can be heavier than any crown. Maria Maddalena's life closed like a book whose pages had been turned too gently to leave deep marks. She did not fall from power in flames, nor meet a violent end that history loves to sensationalize. Instead, her tragedy unfolded softly, so softly that it was almost overlooked. She lived in palaces but never found a home. She carried titles but never shaped her own destiny. She crossed mountains to marry into the Medici, only to spend decades longing for the Austrian hills she once took for granted. Her story reminds us that suffering does not need to be spectacular to be profound. Sometimes it is found in the slow wearing down of the heart, in the daily negotiation between duty and desire, in the quiet ache of someone who watches life pull her in directions she never chose. Maria Maddalena endured all of this with a gentleness that went unrecognized, with a resilience mistaken for passivity, with a quiet dignity that history rarely rewards. When she died on the road home, she left behind no triumphs, no revolutions, no monuments in her name. What she left instead was something smaller, but more human. The image of a woman who continued to hope, even when hope offered her nothing. A woman who longed for belonging, but found herself suspended between two dynasties that used her more than they embraced her. A woman who believed she could reclaim a piece of herself by crossing the Alps, only to collapse before she ever saw their snow again. Her life is a reminder that behind every royal alliance lies a human heart, fragile and longing. Behind every political marriage lies a person whose dreams were rewritten by the ambitions of others. And behind every quiet historical footnote lies a story of someone who simply wanted, in the end, a place to call home. Maria Maddalena never found that place in life. But in telling her story, we return to her a dignity that was denied to her, a small act of remembrance for a woman who moved through history like a shadow, but whose sorrow still whispers across the centuries.